Hello, everybody, and welcome to ID24. This is Billy Gregory. I am here with my co-host, Leonie Watson, and welcome back. Leonie, it's been so long.
It has a whole 5 minutes, I think. Before we kick off with our first speaker, just a quick thank you to our supporters, Barclays Access and the Centre for Inclusive Design, both of whom helped us put together ID24 November 2017. A couple of things before we get going. If you have questions for Aaron, our first presenter, you can tweet them with the hashtag ID24. And we'll be keeping an eye on tweets because we'll be choosing one really great tweet or one particularly interesting question anytime over the next 50 minutes. And the lucky person whose tweet we choose will get a free 90-day JAWS license. So something to help you with testing or accessibility exploration, if that's your field. But I'll say no more right now and hand you back over to Billy.
Yeah, and we'd just like to remind you quickly that if you do like this session, please hit that button and subscribe to our channel, the ID24. We have a lot of plans for what we want to do here, and they involve not just these yearly events, but we want to start doing other things too. So the only way you'll find out about it is if you subscribe to the channel. On that, we would like to kick things off. We would like to welcome Aaron Gustafson, our first speaker. He's here to speak about designing the conversation. Aaron, I'm going to let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. So I'm Aaron Gustafson. I'm a web standards and accessibility advocate at Microsoft. Some of you may know me from A List Apart, where I'm currently the editor-in-chief, or maybe from the Web Standards Project, if you go back a bit longer. And I've been working on the web for, gosh, over 20 years now, which is kind of scary to say. But yeah, so today I'm here to talk about conversational interfaces and such. Chatbots and digital assistants are really becoming more and more popular. They're really kind of all the rage, right? It's the new hotness. And most of these work from specifically coded data sets and models, but there are more than, at last time I checked, 4.59 billion pages of content stored online, trapped in many cases within our websites. And these are articles, stories, blog posts, educational materials, books, and marketing messages, all on the web, but for the most part, an untapped treasure trove of content that could be used in these situations. Now, there have been a few projects, SearchSpiders most notably, that are working to turn that often unstructured mess into something usable, but we can do more, a lot more, to enable our web pages to be more usable by both real people and by the computers that power voice-based user experiences. And oh, by the way, a little aside, you will see a lot of blank screens on here because I just want you to focus on listening. And so this is what I'm here to talk about today. I want to release the content from the screen and empower it to go anywhere and everywhere. I want it to find its way into virtual assistants and other voice response technologies, and even voiceless chatbots, without requiring us to code and recode that content over and over into multiple redundant formats. I also have a dream of enabling our users to actively engage with our content, filling in forms, manipulating widgets and such on the web purely via voice. And it's all possible. I'm here to talk to you about how we can use HTML and ARIA to make our content structured, sensible, and more importantly, meaningful. And it all begins with the humble element. So consider this M element that I have on the screen now. It's the sentence is, I'm, and then in the M element, really happy to see you. Sure, it's visibly rendered as italics, but it also adds emphasis to the content within. HTML is chock full of elements that are useful for conveying meaning, nuance, and relationships, and being aware of these enables us to author more expressive documents, and ignoring them can actually undermine the usability of the content that we're marking up. When we create a web page, we need to be more mindful of the conversation that we're creating with our customers in the process and choose our elements with intent and care. One of the best indicators for how HTML will make it into our virtual assistants is another assistive technology, screen readers. Not only do screen readers do as their name implies, but they also enable users to rapidly navigate a page in various ways and provide the means to translate visual design constructs like proximity, proportion, etc. into audible cues. At least they do when documents are authored thoughtfully. further ado, let's jump in and look at some solid examples of how we can create more meaningful documents and empower them to be more usable in a headless UI context. We'll start by looking at what are called phrasing elements. The emphasis you saw earlier is an example of this element type, and we use them to, or we used to call them inline elements because by default they're visibly displayed as inline text. But phrasing is a much more accurate description of the role they play in our web pages because, well, they mark up phrases. So we saw the emphasis example earlier. I'm, and then inside the emphasis element, really happy to see you. Here the word really is marked up as emphasized, and when spoken it might sound like this: I'm really happy to see you. Sometimes emphasis isn't enough, and when we want to indicate that content is very important for our customers to pay attention to, the strong element is the right way to go. Strong means of strong importance. So in this example, please fill out the form below to contact us. All fields are required. All fields are required is marked up in the strong element because that's an important piece. Now visibly, M and strong are displayed as italics and bold respectively. And in the early days of the web, we also had the I element and the B element that rendered exactly the same as these two, leading many of us to believe, myself included, that they were actually interchangeable. And with B and I being shorter to write, they proliferated on the web. Semantically, however, the elements are quite different from their doppelgangers. The I element is similar to the emphasis element, but a little bit more generic. It's used to indicate an alternate voice or mood. It could be used to indicate sarcasm, idiomatic remarks, and shifts in language. So in the first example I have here, it's a terrible movie and it made $200 million. Go figure. Go figure being marked up in the I element. She is admired for her energy and joie de vivre. In this case, I've used the I element to indicate a shift of the natural language into French, and I'm actually using the lang attribute on the I element to indicate that the language shift is to French. And this indicator, the lang attribute, is actually a simple mechanism for informing a voice synthesizer that it might need to shift its pronunciation. Now, the B element is used for content that should be set apart, or according to the spec, stylistically offset, but it's of no greater importance than the surrounding text. So I like to use it for names of books, I like to use it for names of people or products. Keywords would be another option. Books, films, and other media have their own element, which I'll get to in a moment. But functionally, the B element is a lot like a span. It's generic phrasing content, albeit with a shorter tag. So in the example I have up here, for 12 years and running, over 100,000 companies have adopted the Basecamp way of working, not just tried, but signed up and said, aha, and never looked back. There's nothing else like Basecamp. In this case, I've marked up Basecamp, which is the name of the product that's being sold by this particular block of content, in the B element. And I could then use CSS to make it stylistically offset, but it's really of no greater importance than the surrounding text. Since I mentioned movies and books, I'll quickly bring up that the cite element is something that we can use for the title of cited or referenced works. So in the example I've got on the screen right now, I wrote the book Adaptive Web Design. I've marked that up in the cite element. If you like this talk, you'll find more in-depth information about semantics and a whole lot more in there. HTML has other specialized phrasing constructs too, such as ABBR for abbreviations and acronyms. Here's an example where I say, a ramp embedded in the staircase of Robson Square in Vancouver, BC. And in this case, I'm using an ABBR element to wrap the BC, and I'm using ARIA label to provide an expansion of British Columbia. Now, it used to be that we would use the title attribute to provide that expansion, but title is a bit uneven in terms of its implementation. So ARIA label is the better way to go in terms of providing this content. And if you're not already familiar, ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and it's a spec that maps complex operating system like UI constructs into accessible ones. I'll talk a little bit more about ARIA in a bit. For more technical writing, there's the KBD for keyboard and code elements that can be quite useful. They indicate the keys that a user might want to press, and words or phrases that are being used in writing software or coding documents. So the first example here, press tab to move from link to link within a document. I've marked up tab in a KBD element since it's indicating a keyboard key. And then in the second example, the KBD element is used to indicate keyboard key names. I've marked up the KBD in the code element. A little bit of inception there. Finally, there's the span element, which is used for generic phrases. It's a meaningless element, so it wouldn't be spoken in any different way by default. So in the example here, there is nothing particularly interesting, that bit is marked up in a span, in this sentence. Now, there are a bunch of other phrasing elements that are a little bit less common, things like var and samp, which I highly recommend you take a look at if you're doing more technical writing. Now, links are also phrasing elements, but I wanted to call them out specifically because they're a much richer interface, and they provide a lot of opportunities for fine-tuning how our users interact with them. So the primary way we use links is to connect related content. It's important to choose meaningful words and phrases as the link text, because phrases like "click here to learn more" are not terribly useful, especially if you're having the assistant read out to you the links on a page, which is a key way users of headless UIs often skim pages. So in this example, again, talking about Robson Square, a ramp embedded in the staircase of Robson Square being linked off to the Wikipedia article about that particular landmark in Vancouver, BC. It is possible to have your cake and eat it too by including non-visible text within a link. And this gives you brief, uniform links from a visual standpoint, which might be desirable in certain contexts. But it also allows you to provide content to non-visual browsers as well. So in this example, this is something that I do on my blog. I have a link, and then the actual text of the link is "you can finish reading," and then I have a citation there. The web should just work for everyone in less than 10 minutes. So this is a link going from a teaser of a blog post on kind of an overview page, or maybe it's a tag page. And visibly, I only want to show the finish reading text. So I'm using a B element with a class of hidden to hide "you can" in front of the finish reading. And the web should just work for everyone in less than 10 minutes on the other side of finish reading. So visibly, all you see is finish reading, and what you actually hear is "you can finish reading. The web should just work for everyone in less than 10 minutes. We can also use links to reference content within the current document, or even at a specifically identified position in another document. So in this particular example, to illustrate the concept of layering styles, perhaps it's best to start at the beginning with no style applied. Figure 3.3 shows the lodging article in Safari with only the default browser styles applied. I've linked the text figure 3.3 in this example as an anchor reference using hash figure-3-3 to point to an ID reference to that figure element within that document, which has the ID of figure 3.3. You can even go a step further and identify links as pointing to the permanent home of a piece of reference content. This can be incredibly useful information for crawlers to tease out in terms of creating a data set. So you can do this by using the rel equals bookmark attribute, or rel attribute rather, with a bookmark value. So in the context of blogs, we often use this when we are having a link like I talked about earlier, where you can finish reading a link to the full version of the article. So we would say rel equals bookmark there. You can even inform the user about the language in use on a linked page using the hreflang attribute. So if I am linking to an article in Spanish, I might go ahead and include hreflang on the attribute with the ES value supplied for it, as you can see in this example here. My Spanish pronunciation is pretty horrible, so I'm not going to make you all listen to that. You can also indicate the type of content being linked to. So in this particular example, I'm linking to a giant MP4 file. And the link text is "download this movie." And I can indicate using the type attribute that this is a video/MP4 file. And that could be bubbled up to somebody who is using either a digital assistant or using assistive technology of some sort to help them understand whether they can even possibly play that particular movie. You could also use this, interestingly enough, in the context of a in the context of your CSS to provide certain iconography maybe around the links that point to particular types of content. And in a relatively new addition to the HTML spec, we have the download keyword, which informs the browser that the file in question, the file that's being linked to, should be downloaded rather than presented. It's the download attribute. You don't have to supply a value for it. You just include that on the link, the opening link tag, and it makes a simple HTML document capable of doing so much more. Anchor elements also support non-web, what we call pseudo protocols. Two of the most common examples are mail to for email links and tel for phone numbers, but there's also SMS, webcal. We see those out there every so often. And some operating systems and browsers allow installed apps to register custom protocols that provide access to in-app functionality, for instance. I do want to caution you, though, that unrecognized protocols may actually prompt the user to search for an application that can use that protocol. So it's not a great experience. It's better to stick to the commonly used and commonly supported pseudo protocols like mail to, tel, SMS, webcal. Most of those can get picked up either directly by the operating system or by commonly used software, depending on what sort of device. Even tel, for instance, which started getting used in the mobile space to begin with, can be picked up in Windows or in Mac and launch Skype and make a call that way, or whatever sort of voice over IP service you might use, which is pretty cool. Now, all of this phrasing content is great, but we spent a little while in the weeds, in the minutia. So I want to pull back a little bit and talk about documents themselves and how we might go about organizing them. Now, as you're no doubt aware, headless UIs place a much greater cognitive load on our users. It's hard to keep track of where you are in an interface, and it can be challenging to move around when you can't gather information about the interface based on visual cues. The more complex the interface is, the more challenging this becomes. It's the same for visual interfaces too, which is why the mobile-first movement encourages to focus each page on a single task. This reduces the noise and raises the signal. But most web pages, as we all know, are the antithesis of clear and straightforward. As our screens enlarged, we found more and more stuff to fill that space. Sharing links, related content, cross promotions, and so on. Sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the actual content. The example that I have up here is from an old version of Forbes. Thankfully, they've redesigned since then. But in this particular instance, the content that somebody would come to this page to find is maybe 10% of the viewable screen area. To combat this, screen readers provide numerous mechanisms that enable users to gather information about the current interface and move efficiently through it to the bit that's relevant to them in the current moment. One of the mechanisms is browsing by heading. The various heading levels in HTML create a natural document outline, and assistive technologies can enable users to skim content using these headings. Since only the contents of the heading elements are read out in this mode, it's best to avoid cutesy marketing phrases and stick to summarizing the contents of a section. Another mechanism available for skimming an interface involves moving the focus caret from one interactive element to another. Traditionally, that movement's done via the keyboard using the tab key, but it's also possible via voice using keywords like next and previous. In most documents, this means moving from link to link, like you might see in an example like this. So this is a excerpt from an article that I wrote, and I have two links in here. One link is to the Wikipedia entry for John Harsanyi. The next one is a link to the Wikipedia entry for his veil of ignorance concept. So you would move from one to the other when tabbing through this document. Supporting skimming in this way makes the text that we choose for links even more critical for ensuring a good experience for our users. It's also worth noting that form elements and buttons are also focusable, and I'll discuss form elements more in a later section. You can also add elements that would not traditionally be focusable into the tab order by adding a tab index attribute with a value of 0 to them. So in this example, I have the paragraph, please fill out the form below completely. All fields are required that I showed earlier. And I've added a tab index of 0 so that I ensure if somebody is tabbing through the document before they move into the form, they're able to actually have that content read out to them. This ensures critical interface components are not accidentally bypassed by users who are skimming an interface. Now, the final way users can traverse documents is via what are called landmarks. And the concept of landmarks surfaced in the development of the ARIA spec. And the idea was that you could use the role attribute to define specific regions on a page based on their function. So in the example here, I have a div element, just a generic division. It's got a role of or an ID of nav, but that doesn't provide any context about the list that's contained within it. But if I assign a role of navigation to it, now all of a sudden I'm indicating that the list within has to do with navigation. So this is a way of exposing that and making it more explicit what the purpose of this particular interface is. There are a number of role values that fill this landmark role, and I'm going to show a couple in action in a moment here. Banner, navigation, search, main, complementary, and content info are the ones you'll most commonly see. 24 Ways is sort of an advent calendar for web professionals if you haven't seen it before. It's a magazine of sorts, but it's also highly interactive and accessible, and they use landmarks to identify all of the key areas of a page. Here's an example of their header, which they've given a role of banner to indicate that it is the banner for their site. They have a role of main duplicated onto the main element, which isn't truly necessary, but it is there for some redundancy to catch if there's anything that maybe supports the role but doesn't support the actual element. Again, their navigation, they have the redundancy of the nav element and the role of navigation. The nav element will inherit that role automatically in more modern browsers and assistive technology. And then finally, they have the footer element with a role of content info, which is used to indicate that the container or that the element contains information about the content, such as copyright designations. And here's how users can experience that.
Main landmark 2015 heading level 1. Navigation landmark browse 24 ways heading level 1. Search landmark search 24 ways. Content info landmark copyright 2005-2016 24 ways and now authors. Colofon.
Landmarks also give users the opportunity to jump directly to a location within an interface, which is incredibly helpful. In a voice context, a user might be able to ask their assistant to read me the navigation for this page, or search for wooden baby toys. And the assistant could use the landmarks within the HTML document to quickly respond to those commands, either taking them directly to the navigation element, the first one that they see, or maybe reading all of them. Or in the case of search for wooden baby toys, it could focus in on the search form and actually put wooden baby toys into that form and submit it, and then respond with the results. It's worth noting that many of these landmarks have equivalent HTML tags, and that's because HTML5 and ARIA were largely developed at the same time, and we're looking to address some of the same limitations of the web at the time. So the banner role is actually automatically assigned to the first header element that is not contained inside of a sectioning element. So if inside of your body you have a header element as the first element, or anywhere in that initial siblings, or the initial children rather, of the body element, then that would become the banner. Any navigation or any nav element gets assigned a role of navigation. The main element gets a role of main. Asides get a role of complementary. And the first footer element, very much like the first header, the first footer element that is not inside of a sectioning element gets the content info role automatically. The only one from this list of roles that I've shared that does not have an inherent role assigned to it is the search landmark. Now, one last bit I want to touch on before I move on to discuss forms is the div element. We often see the div employed in web pages when the designer wants to group some elements together, and that's fine, but the div is a meaningless element. It adds nothing to the interface in terms of context. By contrast, there are other organizational elements that do add value to the page. paragraphs, lists, figures, figure captions, articles, sections, headers, footers, main, nav, aside. There are a ton of meaningful elements out there that can enable our assistants to do more for our customers. And the more we use them, the more powerful our assistants become and the more powerful our users feel. For instance, using article and heading elements can enable voice commands like read me all of the news headlines from the front page of the New York Times without involving any sort of specialized data feed. The generic div gets you none of these benefits. Now, as you can see, HTML has a lot to offer in terms of enabling our interfaces to operate effectively in the world of headless UIs. Beyond just content, though, it has the capacity to streamline interactivity, such as the kind that we see in forums. Now, forums are a bit of a necessary evil. We need them in order to gather information in service of our users, but often they're poorly planned and even more poorly executed, which leads to a poor user experience for all of our users, regardless of how they're interacting with the forum. Thankfully, HTML has our backs here too, enabling us to make necessary connections, to clarify the purpose of a forum, and to expedite the completion process. But let's start with something simple, field labels. Before we even get into the HTML though, let's talk a little bit about labels themselves. The words we choose in labeling our forms, as is true for the rest of our content, really matter a lot. This is something that Facebook learned the hard way a few years ago. Over the 2011 holidays, Facebook's users were uploading photos like crazy. And in the span of a few days, Facebook processed more photo uploads than are contained in the entirety of Flickr, which is a heck of a lot of photos. Now, one of the unintended consequences of this deluge of photo uploads was a significant uptick in people asking for Facebook to remove specific ones. Facebook received millions of these, what they refer to as photo reports, but they made no sense. Moms holding babies reported for harassment, pictures of puppies reported for hate speech, and so on. Roughly 97% of these photo reports were dramatically miscategorized. Now, Facebook's engineers reached out to some of the users who'd reported these photos somewhat erroneously to get a bit more background regarding their submissions. Now, at the time, Facebook's photo reporting interface provided a list of reasons users could choose from if they wanted a photo removed. But as they soon discovered, many of the reports were made because users didn't want the photos posted for reasons other than those provided. In some cases, it was because they didn't like how they looked in the photo. In others, it was because the photo was of an ex-partner or even a beloved pet that they'd shared with an ex but no longer get to see. The existing photo reporting tool had not done a good job of accounting for these more personal reasons for wanting a photo removed, so the Facebook engineers went to work. They added a step that asked, how does this photo make you feel? The options they provided were simple: embarrassing, upsetting, saddening, bad photo, and other. The other option provided a free response field that users could fill in. And with this system in place, they found that 50% of the reporters who answered the new question chose one of the provided options. That was great, but there was still a problem. 34% of the other respondents were writing "it's embarrassing" in the blank rather than choosing the embarrassing option already provided. What the Facebook team realized was that people weren't identifying with the quote-unquote embarrassing text, or they may have thought it was referring to them rather than assuming an implied "it's." A subtle shift in language was needed. So they changed the label to "please describe the photo," and they updated the options and simplified them to mirror how people actually talk. "It's embarrassing," "it's a bad photo of me," "it makes me sad." And with this subtle change, they were actually able to increase the percentage of photo reporters who chose one of the options provided to a whopping 78%. Words matter. Even in something as simple and banal as a forum, the words we choose set the tone for our users' experiences and often have an effect on what they do, or as Facebook found, what they fail to do. In their Alexa Skills Kit, Amazon recommends that we make it clear that our users need to respond. So perhaps instead of using labels like first name, we should consider a more conversational and clear request.
What's your first name?
Consistency is important too. So if you go this route, make sure the users are always referred to as you and their information and preferences are your and not my. That's one of the inconsistencies that drives me nuts on the web. You have being referred to as you throughout the content, and then it's my account. Don't do that. It's also important to write error messages that are more conversational and clear about what it is that we're asking for and why.
Without your first name, I won't know how to address you. Could you please provide it?
Finally, authoring compelling button text can help drive home what a user is doing in submitting the form.
Reserve your spot button.
I'm sure most people out there, most of your customers don't want to actually submit to you, so choosing alternate text is probably a good idea. Now, I've already mentioned the importance of labeling a bunch of times here, so let's take a look at how to properly do it, starting with one of the simplest examples possible. Here I have the text, "What's your first name?" and then I have an input element with a name that is first_name. Now, while it may seem perfectly reasonable to mark up form fields like this with text and then an input, there's no association of the question, "What's your first name?" and the text the text field that follows. To create that association, you need to use a label element. That will ensure that the label can be read by assistive technology when the field is focused. Now, labels can be either explicitly or implicitly associated, which this example currently is not because I've simply wrapped "What's your first name?" in the label element itself. There's no association yet. Explicit association relies on the for attribute, whose value should be equal to the ID attribute value of the associated field. So in this example, I'm just using the same value as the name attribute of first_name as the ID as well, and then that same value goes into the for attribute on the label to create that explicit association. Implicit association relies on the label element containing both the associated field and the label value. So in this case, I don't need to use the for attribute. I could simply wrap the label around both the label text and the field itself. You can even combine these two approaches, but you don't necessarily have to. In most cases, explicit association is the simplest and clearest choice. Once you have a good label, it's time to turn your attention to the field type. There are a bunch of options available in HTML, and it's important to choose the right one for each job in a form. If you're just looking for a simple response from the user, the text input's your go-to. It doesn't get any simpler than that. If you're asking for someone's email address, there's a special field type for that. It looks like a text field visually, but in browsers that understand type equals email, they can also validate that field for you automatically. But if the browser doesn't understand the HTML5 field type of email, that's okay. The field will simply revert to being a text field. And frankly, that's what we had for the previous 15 years of working on the web. So we know we can handle that. And you can and should still validate the field to see if it's a valid email address on the server side. And we'll discuss that validation shortly. Now, this is a perfect example of progressive enhancement, which is a topic that's quite near and dear to my heart. I'll make a quick shameless plug here. You can read the first edition of my book, Adaptive Web Design, online for free. I've got the URL up there, or you can go to adaptivewebdesign.info. The second edition came out in December, 2 years ago almost now. And you can read an excerpt from that on A List Apart, or read the first chapter from the New Writers website as well. But back to inputs. So HTML5 gave us a specific field type for entering URLs as well, type equals URL. And as with the email field type, browsers can handle the validation for you automatically if they support that field type. Free response can be useful, but sometimes we want to have a little more control over the answers our users provide. Let's say we wanted them to choose one of the options from the many possible ones that we saw in the Facebook example from earlier. It's a perfect candidate for the radio input type. Only one radio input from a set identified by identical name attributes can be selected at a time. Another option for accomplishing the same goal uses a select dropdown. What you see here is a direct one-for-one comparison of the radio options that I showed on the previous screen. You could use either of these approaches for numbers, but another option is the range input, which gets rendered as a slider in modern browsers. With the range input type, you can define a minimum and a maximum acceptable value, and you can even define the step between those two bookends. So in this example, how loud is Spinal Tap? It's a range going from a minimum of 0 to a maximum of course, 11, with a step of 1. There are a ton of other field types I could talk about, but I only have so much time, and there's a lot I want to cover. So I'm going to move on a little bit. UX design is often concerned with reducing the friction of accomplishing a task, and as such, we should look for every opportunity to do so in our forms. Consider a form construct asking for a US phone number, for example. If you happen to be based in the US or do business with US companies, you've probably seen this where the number is chunked out into 3 fields. Instead of a single field enabling a user to continuously type their phone number, the designers chose to break it apart into 3 fields. And they probably did this to enforce consistent number formatting in every submission. But frankly, that's a back-end problem. By going down this path, the designers have placed the burden on their users rather than on their developers, and the experience suffers from it. Sure, you could write some JavaScript to auto-advance a user from field to field as they type, but without JavaScript, they have to do it manually. And even if the JavaScript enhancement is available, it can limit the user's ability to edit one of the fields if they make a mistake. Furthermore, when it comes to using this interface via voice, users are required to supply 3 separate values. And moreover, each field requires a label. Most developers in the US are only likely to know how to label the first of those 3 boxes, the area code, and actual users would probably be baffled if you asked them to provide their central office code or line number. For all of these reasons, it just makes sense to work with what HTML gives us. There's a field for telephone numbers, an input with a type of tel. It doesn't validate phone numbers because there are frankly way too many formats internationally, but that's okay. It's inconsequential for us to write code to sanitize and homogenize structured information like phone numbers, social security numbers, and the like. And honestly, we should be writing that code anyway because you can never trust the client, even if you enforce structure and consistency via JavaScript or markup. We'll come back to that idea shortly. We should absolutely take every opportunity to work harder so that our users don't have to. Dates are another classic case where we add needless complexity. Thankfully, HTML has us covered there too. If capable, using the date type or date time local, month, week, or time input types, capable browsers will give our users an enhanced experience and provide things like date pickers. But if they don't, they'll just fall back to a text field, and that's okay. And another bonus to us as front-end developers, we don't have to add additional dependencies to our code in terms of CSS and JavaScript, and our users get a consistent experience from site to site in the browser they happen to like to use. Now, forms can be incredibly frustrating to fill out, especially if they're particularly long. As designers, we're tasked with reducing users' frustration. Now, errors happen, it's a fact of life, but we can help our users avoid errors by taking a few simple steps. Most browsers allow users to store information to be auto-filled into forms. Some automatically collect that information. Firefox is one example. And they watch for common data that they can prompt the user to fill in later. Some even go so far as to store the values you enter along with the corresponding name or ID value, and will prompt you to fill that information into future forms that use the same name or ID. For this reason, it makes sense to turn off autocomplete, the autocomplete attribute, when you're asking for sensitive information like social security numbers here in the US, or passport numbers perhaps. It used to be that all we had was an on-off option for this feature, but we've recently been granted additional values that enable us to get really granular in the kinds of information we're asking for, and enable some really robust autofilling. These values come from a set of predefined tokens. There are a ton of these tokens that you can look up. There's a great article by Jason Grigsby that gets into this stuff in terms of autocomplete. I'm not going to get into every one, but I want to walk through a quick example. And it's also worth noting that these various keywords can actually be combined together to create some really interesting things. So here we have an example of a field set where the legend is ship the blue gift to, and then there's a couple of address related fields. So since this is about the blue gift, I can actually create sections for the autocomplete. So in this case, I have section -blue. Since this is shipping information, I can use the shipping keyword to prefix the street address, address level 2, and postal code values. So those are all modifiers that can be combined together. And in a headless UI context, the assistant could easily prompt the user to autofill these fields or ask which previously stored values they might like to use, much as Amazon and other online e-commerce shops ask which address you want to use from your stored shipping addresses. The order, if you're curious, goes like this. You have the optional section, then you have shipping or billing optionally. You also have the optional modifiers for telephone-related things, home, work, mobile, fax, and pager. Why pager is still around, I'm not sure. And then you have the autofill token name. So the longest example you might see would be something like this: autocomplete section-red shipping mobile tel. And in this case, the keys actually refer to what it is that we're asking for in the label. So the label of this particular field is there a mobile number we can reach you on regarding delivery? Okay, so I'm using the section that I'm identifying as section red. That's kind of a back-end thing for me. But then I'm using the shipping modifier plus the mobile modifier to reference a telephone token. So it is actually directly connected to that. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, this sort of affordance can do a ton to reduce the friction of forms. And if you're keen to learn more about it, definitely check out Jason Grigsby's post. It's on the Cloud4 blog. So that can help users quickly fill out some fields automatically. But what about everything else? Well, first of all, we should let users know when a field is required. A common approach is to provide a visual indicator, such as an asterisk. If not all fields on the form are required, obviously it would be better to avoid this situation altogether by only having required fields in the form. Hint, hint. But when you're required, and then you could simply introduce the form saying all of the fields are required, as I mentioned earlier. But regardless of the way you go, you should be using the required attribute to ensure modern browsers can't submit the form if the field is empty. And you should also use the ARIA required attribute to inform assistive technology that the field is required, because not all browsers map the required attribute to ARIA required automatically. We should also provide useful hints as to the type of response that we're expecting. This can go a long way in helping users avoid issues before they happen. So in this particular example, we have a more complicated request. I'm asking for a Delta flight number beginning with the letters DL, followed by 2 or more numbers. So what flight are you looking for? I have a placeholder placed in there, e.g. DL50 or 5407, and then I'm using the pattern attribute to do client-side validation of that, but then I have server-side validation happening, obviously, as well. Now, the reason that we want to do validation in the browser is because round trips to the server are expensive, especially on mobile connections or over crappy hotel Wi-Fi. And we can help our users avoid that costly experience by validating locally. Traditionally, this meant using JavaScript. As I've mentioned a few times, HTML5 aware browsers can do this for us for free. Client-side validation begins with noting the required fields. It's worth noting that we don't have a good native solution for choose one or more of checkboxes. So you'll need to involve JavaScript for that. But starting off with required and ARIA required, then the next step is choosing the right field type so that we can pick up any native validation that might be available. And then if a native input type doesn't exist, you can fall back to using the pattern attribute to enforce the particular validation scheme that you want to use. Now, browsers that implement HTML5 validation will automatically notify users of field errors inline, typically indicating to them the first error when the user attempts to submit the form. If you want more control or want to handle the validation in browsers that don't implement the HTML5 validation algorithm, you can use the declarative instruction provided by the type, the required attribute, and the pattern attributes to roll your own. And you can do it in probably about 150 lines of JavaScript. Just be sure that when you do so, you do it in an accessible way. So in this code example that I've got on the screen right now, I'm asking for your email address. So I've got the email type, I've got required and ARIA required. And in this case, the field has come back as invalid. So I'm marking it as invalid using ARIA-invalid equals true. And then I'm including an error message along with that, which you can see as the strong element at the end. Your email address is required, and I'm using ARIA described by on the field to point to the ID or to that ID'd strong element so that that error message gets read out.
Your emails are edit required invalid entry. Your email address is required blank.
Now, client-side validation is great, but it's no substitute for server-side validation. Back in 2001, when the original Xbox was the game system to drool over, we as an industry put a lot of faith in the browser and didn't really think about how our sites could be hacked, for lack of a better term. I remember one instance where someone realized a major vulnerability in an e-commerce site, and it involved this very gaming system. In their infinite wisdom, the developer of the site had decided to place the price of the Xbox in a hidden input. And since it was hidden, no one could see it. Yeah, an enterprising web designer could view the source and see it, but these were the days before browsers had any tool for web developers to manipulate a page in real time like we have now. But the thing is, browsers in those days did still have a save option to save the web page for offline viewing. And once saved, the file was editable. So a daring soul downloaded the web page and adjusted the price to $1. Then they loaded the local HTML document in their browser and submitted the form, which took them back to the original site with the Xbox in their cart for, you guessed it, $1. They checked out and got their nearly free Xbox a week or so later. The developer had no checks in place to make sure their products couldn't be sold for anything other than their listed price. They didn't realize that you can never trust the client. You should always validate on the server side. Just because a user has JavaScript or a browser is capable of doing HTML5 validation doesn't mean you can get away with assuming that validation criteria was met. It's inconsequential these days to change a web page's markup, adjust scripts, or otherwise compromise a web page without or using only the tools that are built into virtually every browser out there. I know I routinely fix sites in order to be able to submit forms when they have bad logic in them. And since the server side is really your last line of defense against errors and omissions in forms, you need to be prepared to return a user to the form and clue them in as to what's gone wrong. You want to start by summarizing the server-side errors that you found. Put a message at the top of the form that says something like, "There were errors with your form submission," and then lists them out. You start with a helpful introduction. List the errors in the order that they were presented in the form. I like to use an ordered list, and I like to actually link each of those errors to the specific field that is in an error state, using a link to the ID of that field. So in this case, message is a required field, name is a required field, email is a required field. Message, name, and email are all links directly to the fields that have an error. You can add a role of alert, which can make ARIA aware browsers read those contents early on.
Contact retreats 4 weeks. There were errors with your form submission. 1. Message is a required field. 2. Name is a required field. 3. Email is a required field.
And then you want to implement that same sort of inline error messaging that we saw earlier in order to indicate to a user how it is that they can address that issue. You want to make sure that if the user actually entered a value, that you bring it back so they can correct their mistakes rather than having to start from scratch. HTML is a truly robust and expressive language that's often overlooked and undervalued, but it has the incredible potential to nurture conversations with our users without requiring a lot of effort on our part. Simply taking the time to code web pages well will enable our sites to do more, thereby enabling our users to do more. Hopefully this rather brief overview has opened up your eyes to the wonderful world of HTML and how semantic markup can make our content structured, sensible, and most importantly, meaningful. And if you are already a true believer, I hope you'll walk away from this session with some new techniques and approaches that you can put to work in your own work. Thank you all very much.
Awesome job, Aaron. It was really, really, really great. We did have a couple of questions from the crowd, from the crowd, whatever we call it, the universe. We have about 2 minutes before we need to wrap up this session, but we can ask them quickly. Leonie, did you want?
Yeah, we did. Thierry Koblenz asked whether being able to hover over an element that has the title attribute, like the abbreviation, was useful to some people, and he wondered whether both that and ARIA label were a possibility together. And actually, somebody else who goes by the really splendid Twitter name of Tall Drink of Water asked a very similar question, whether those two attributes were usable at the same time on the same element.
They certainly are usable on the same element at the same time. There's no conflict that I'm aware of. Steve Faulkner has a great overview of why you should pretty much almost never use the title attribute. There might be specific use cases where you may want to use the title attribute in order to provide that tooltip-like experience for sighted users. But if you're using it for accessibility purposes, don't.
Great, good advice. Thanks, Aaron. And just a quick note for asking the question and some of the greatest RT and ID24 vibe spreading action that we've seen so far. We're going to give this hour's JAWS license to Tall Drinker Water. So if you're listening, send us a DM with your contact information and we'll make sure that gets out to you.
Awesome. Congrats.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Aaron. It was a pleasure. And
thanks for letting me kick things off.
Well, you did a heck of a job. So we'll talk to you soon. To everybody else out there, we'll be back at the top of the hour with our second presentation.
Talk to you then.